What sets Moon Knight apart from other superheroes is his dissociative identity disorder, which gives him multiple personalities, or alters, with their own distinct mannerisms and skills. Originally, these identities were simply that, identities that Mark Spector would move between in order to access different social circles. But over the years, the character evolved into the one that we know and love today, with his psychology becoming a primary focus point of his stories and what separates him from his contemporaries. I have spent the past couple of months reading through a ton of Moon Knight comics in order to piece together this video, which covers a lot. The complete history of the character's mental state as it's depicted in the comics, a comprehensive rundown of each of Moon Knight's alters, a deep dive into how his DID came to be. Was it the result of trauma from nearly being killed as a child, or was it due to his brain being colonized by an ancient consciousness from beyond space-time? Find out all of this and more on today's installment of Comic Drake. But before we get too far into things, I need to give a quick thank you to my all-time favorite sponsor, Magic Spoon. Now, I have been obsessed with the brand new honey nut flavor recently, since it's got just the right amount of sweetness without killing my waistline. Magic Spoon is only 140 calories per serving, with 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and only 4 net grams of carbs. It's keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and low-carb, so I could start off my day right without having to worry about my calorie count. If you go to magicspoon.com/Drake and use my code Drake at checkout, then you'll get $5 off your very own variety box, where you can choose from flavors like maple waffle, cookies and cream, or cinnamon. Plus, they started shipping to Canada and the UK with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you're not completely satisfied for any reason, you'll get a complete refund, no questions asked. Once again, that's magicspoon.com/Drake and offer code Drake for $5 off. Thank you very much, Magic Spoon, for your continued support, but now let's get back to the video. Making his first appearance in Werewolf by Night number 32 in 1975, Moon Knight wasn't that fleshed out as a character at first. He was simply the antagonist of the week that was looking to take down the titular werewolf with an arsenal of silver weapons. It wouldn't be until about a year later that he got his own solo series, which gave him a much more robust origin with his introduction as mercenary Mark Spector, who was gunned down in front of the altar of Khonshu, the Egyptian god of the moon, who resurrected Spector as his avatar, the Moon Knight. The key selling point of Moon Knight as a superhero was that instead of having just one secret identity, he had 3. First is the aforementioned true identity, Mark Spector, a soldier of fortune who was named after a comic book shop worker that writer Doug Moench was friends with. Although Mark Spector is his real identity, it's ironically the one that's seen the least in the old school Moon Knight comics, with it only really being used when he needs to work with criminals by using his connections from his time as a mercenary, or to hit up contacts from his old days in the CIA. Now, Mark did use his blood money to invest in the stock market and start up a few successful businesses under the name Stephen Grant, and he uses this persona to rub elbows with the elites, munch on hors d'oeuvres, and make deals. This is also the primary identity that Mark would use back in the day, with even his girlfriend calling him Steven. I mean, if you had access to this huge mansion, why would you not enjoy it? Finally, there's cab driver Jake Lockley. In the original scripts, he was known as Jake Blank, but that was changed to Lockley when they eventually went to print, presumably because blank is just a little on the nose for a fake name. Through his driving and frequent patronage of a local diner, the Jake persona is able to hear the word on the street, but he's oftentimes a tad bit heavy-handed with his questioning, leading to his usual contacts to just assume that he's an undercover cop. Also, it's not really relevant, but Mark eventually gave Jake a fake mustache, and I just love how excited he looks when he first puts it on. Mark takes his various roles extremely seriously, with him committing to the speech, mannerisms, and actions of his assumed identities, even when he's in the privacy of his own home. However, it's worth noting that while Doug Moench did joke that he made Moon Knight a little too quickly after reading Sybil, a book about a woman with DID, he clarified to readers that Mark didn't have a psychological condition. However, with the benefit of hindsight, there are some bits in the classic comics that could be interpreted as DID. For example, in one issue, Mark mentions that he sometimes has a hard time keeping his identity separate. There's also the time that Mark explained the differences between his various personas, to which his girlfriend Marlene replies that it's all in his mind and she wishes that he would just admit it already. But in a more serious example, the statue of Khonshu was destroyed, sending Mark into a complete mental breakdown. Marlene commented that Mark relies on that statue for strength, which is coupled by his 4-way schizophrenia, Yeah, these early issues made a lot of references and jokes about schizophrenia that didn't age very well. Like, Mark and Marlene are always joking about his schizo moments. And despite the fact that schizophrenia and DID are two completely different conditions, they are both real ones that actual people have. And especially when Moon Knight was first being published in the 80s, these disorders weren't really understood by the general public, which has led to a ton of negative language and sensationalism. But regardless, when Marlene revealed to Mark that the destroyed statue was actually a fake, he mentally returned back to normal in an instant. But this was a notable storyline because even though it is a little bit weird and problematic, it was the first instance of Mark's psychology becoming a theme to the character. A few years later, a new writer came on to fill in for the comic for a couple of issues, and by sheer coincidence, his name was Stephen Grant. In this issue, DID is mentioned a lot more explicitly, with Moon Knight constantly referring to Mark Spector as if he was a unique entity. Now, ordinarily, I would interpret this as Mark trying to put away and move forward from his violent mercenary past, but then Stephen Grant later came back and wrote a story where Mark is literally talking to his other identities, which isn't brought up again for some reason. In fact, shortly after this issue, the entire concept of Mark having multiple personas was basically abandoned. See, for many years, Mark's other identities were either downplayed or straight up ignored in favor of writing Moon Knight as more of a dark loner character. Though that is a little bit different in the miniseries in 1985 where some monks of Khonshu established a psychic connection with Mark and were in his head, guiding him towards crimes that needed his attention. We kind of forget about that though. Over time, Moon Knight languished in obscurity within the Marvel Universe, barely ever being used. But in 2006, writer Charlie Huston essentially reinvented the character into how we know him today, especially diving into Mark's psychology, with this book heavily featuring visions of Khonshu appearing to him, egging Mark on to kill the criminals that he apprehends. Huston's book also introduces a recurring theme throughout the entirety of the Moon Knight franchise. Is Khonshu real, or is he just a mental delusion that Mark has from having nearly died in Egypt? Huston's series also directly tackles the subject of Mark's DID during a scene where a psychologist manages to pull out each of his various personalities by having Mark look at the moon. But at the end of the issue, it was revealed that all of this was actually an elaborate ruse to blackmail the Doctor into giving Mark a spotless record of mental health, which, when you think about it, doesn't make much sense. But you know what? There was actually a book that came out right before this that did explicitly confirm that Mark had DID. And it's in a different universe entirely. It's Ultimate Spider-Man. In this alternate universe, we can see right into Mark's head, where Stephen Grant is shown as an alter, along with this little girl who we can only assume is some version of Lockley. So when the writer of that book, Brian Michael Bendis, was finally able to get his hands on the main universe Moon Knight, he brought over the DID angle from Ultimate Spider-Man with him. But the alters that he had weren't the ones that we've been talking about all this time. No, they were Spider-Man, Wolverine, and Captain America, complete with Mark donning these gauntlets that shot webs, popped out claws, or created an energy shield for whenever his various alters took the wheel of his body. Naturally, since this was a mini-series, this was short-lived. But at long last, Moon Knight was overtly depicted with his iconic mental disorder, not just hints or implications. Fast forward to the widely influential Moon Knight series in 2014, written by scumbag sex pest Warren Ellis, where the relationship between Khonshu and Spector's DID is played around with a lot. What's nice about this depiction of the character is that it's explicitly confirmed that Mark doesn't actually have DID, because it's not a disease or a sickness that can be caught. Instead, Spector's condition is the result of his resurrection by Khonshu, coming back not just as Mark Spector, but as Moon Knight and two other personalities based on the god's four aspects: Pathfinder, Embracer, Defender, and the Watcher of Overnight Travelers. But there's also a super special secret aspect called the One Who Lives on Hearts. I honestly love this. It's respectful to the real people with DID because it's very much not that. And ideally, it wouldn't add to the stigmatization of the real world condition. It's also a fun way to tie in more supernatural aspects of the character without straight up giving him superpowers. 10 out of 10 from a 0 out of 10 human being. But you know what they say about broken clocks. It's never stated which of Mark's alters is supposed to represent each aspect of Khonshu. But what about that secret aspect? I mean, yeah, it was confirmed that there's Spector, Lockley, Grant, and Moon Knight, but apparently there's a fifth? What gives? My best assumption would be that it's the new persona that was introduced in the series, Mr. Knight, who dresses in a solid white suit and handles detective work. Now, this is something that a lot of folks might raise objections to, as some people think that this is just an alternate costume. But there's actually been a couple of times where Mr. Knight is very much seen as being a unique entity from the other alters. And you know what? I like that. What I'm not a fan of, though, is Moon Knight being its own alter. That just feels weird to me. Like, out of everything, that should just be a superhero costume. You know? See, the best Moon Knight stories, in my opinion, embrace the idea of DID, with each of the alters coming together to form Moon Knight. Together, they are stronger than the sum of their parts. Anyway, this comic also plays with the idea of each alter being represented with their own variant of the costume, such as Mr. Knight's aforementioned suit, and Lockley getting this creepy mask for a little bit, which was thankfully changed later to him just rolling up the costume. Unfortunately, this concept was abandoned, which is a real shame because I think the visual differences add a fun layer of depth to the character, something that I think is demonstrated very well in the Disney Plus show, with the magical costume that the showrunners decided to go with adapting to each alter. But let's loop back around to Khonshu. As I mentioned earlier, the 2014 series really wanted to drive home the fact that Mark's DID was a result of Khonshu's presence, and that was further made apparent when the god temporarily left Spector in favor of going to another avatar. What's interesting here, though, is that Khonshu wasn't the only one to leave Mark's brain in this instance. His alters left as well until the god took Mark back, and then they returned. But even this will be challenged in 2016, with a new series that decided to put Mark's mental journey at the forefront. This book opens with Spector inside of a mental institution, with all of his adventures over the years having just been a massive delusion. The border of what's real and what's not is a blurred line, as the comic sends Mark through many fantastical settings. In addition to that, Mark moves back and forth between his various alters, with new artists coming on board to depict each one's experience, from the film noir aesthetics of Stephen Grant to the high-flung space adventures of a brand new alter named Moon Knight 1. At the same time, though, the entire story could have just taken place in Mark's head, as the first and last issues both close on the same rooftop, greatly implying that the book was just a mental journey of self-discovery, with the many fantastical elements having just been metaphorical. This series also gives us a look into Mark's childhood, revealing that his DID manifested all the way back then, with it later being explained that it was a trauma response to having nearly been killed by a Nazi. Yet this story also has Khonshu appearing to young Mark, which throws on the same ambiguity that's been seen throughout the rest of the book, as it's up for debate what's real, what's fake, and what's just a metaphor. This seems to have been abandoned, though, in the 2021 series, which has gone back to the explanation that Mark's mind was shattered after communing with Khonshu. In a really bizarre storyline, Moon Knight does battle with a man who can assimilate people into a hive mind through the ingestion of his sweat. Look, I know that sounds really fucking weird, but trust me, this book is actually really good and you should read it. But anyway, Mark takes him down by licking the sweat and allowing this dude to enter his mind, exposing him to the dark and alien consciousness of Khonshu, resulting in the guy's mind becoming completely shattered and losing his grasp on sanity. But you know what else is interesting? This book also introduces readers to a second avatar of Khonshu named Hunter's Moon, and he has been seen directly talking to the god, hopefully cementing once and for all that Khonshu is real. That is, unless he and Mark are both suffering from the same extremely specific delusion. Yet even more fascinating is that at the time of this recording, Hunter doesn't appear to have any alters. So if we're sticking with the angle that coming into contact with this ancient god is too much for a mortal consciousness to handle, then how did he get around that? Well, Hunter's Moon explained that when Mark became Moon Knight, the memories of Khonshu's previous avatars from over the years were supposed to transfer into his mind, giving him access to all of their skills and knowledge, like the Avatar state from Avatar. It's implied that something went wrong in the process for Mark, though. Is that what led to him developing DID? Or did he have it already, and that's why he couldn't properly download all the data properly? Right now, we don't know, and I like that. As a massive Moon Knight fan, I enjoy seeing how the character has evolved and adapted over the years, especially with how he changes to better reflect the ever-expanding understanding that we have about mental health in the real world. But I'll also be the first one to admit that all the back and forth on things really just makes things confusing and not in a fun way. I just really wish that Marvel would commit to a backstory and build off of that. Personally, I would make it to where Mark's DID was developed in childhood as a trauma response, but that was made into something completely different when Khonshu entered his mind. This fleshes out the character's backstory in a way that would get rid of the idea that you could just catch a mental disorder, and by fictionalizing it, writers can still play around with the fun multiple personality gimmick, while also not exaggerating and stigmatizing actual DID. But hopefully this has been an interesting rundown. Like I said, I ended up having to read a lot of books for it, and while it was a lot of fun, boy oh boy was it also stressful. But if you like this video, then why not consider subscribing or even watching another one? And if you like this and want to read more about Moon Knight, good news, I have a video that explains every good place to start reading Moon Knight, so maybe give that a watch and buy some books. But anyway, hope you learned at least a little something new, and hopefully I'll see you next time.